Hello and welcome to State of Play on MintPress News, the weekly geopolitical news show that addresses and analyzes the top international news story that you may have missed over the weekend. But let's be honest, this audience didn't miss this one. Tonight, we are going to be examining the outbreak of sectarian violence in Syria, how best to interpret the information/disinformation landscape surrounding the internal security situation in the country, and what external actors have a vested interest in having the violence continue. I am your host, Greg Stoker, and I am joined today by Robert Inlakesh, a political analyst, journalist, and documentary filmmaker who has worked with TRT, MAyadeen English, QUDS News, and is currently a staff writer here at MintPress News. And I personally think he has the most balanced and reasonable takes on Syria that I've come across. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to say that I don't like covering Syria because the sectarian nature of everything is going on makes me end up honestly with more death threats than I get for championing the end of Israeli occupation and apartheid. Like, I just found like no matter how you cover Syria, someone's going to have a problem with it. So let me begin by acknowledging my bias with this. I'm an anti-war activist and analyst, and since I am an American, that means by extension, I am anti-American imperialism. I can't not talk about the designs of American, Israeli, Turkish, and to a lesser extent, Russian interests in Syria. Iranian too, obviously. And, I can't not bring up the fact that, Jolani, now al-Shara, has a complicated past. He was captured by Special Operations Forces in 2006 and was released in 2011 during the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. That's kind of suspect. I grew up in that community. I can't pretend that the Israeli and U.S. State Departments are very pleased by how the situation has unfolded. And if you think they have Syria's best interest in mind, I don't know what to tell you. And and I also get accused of being an Assadist. But then again, we were totally prepared to jump in and seize Damascus International Airport in 2013, but Obama called it off. So there's that. I don't know what to tell you guys. And I think Syria deserves a much more nuanced conversation guided by Syrians. You'll find that there are two separate takes with Syria, depending on their association with Assad, which is a great distinction from Palestine, where there's pretty much a universal alignment. So I've been talking to Syrians from different backgrounds and regions all weekend. I've been parsing through video evidence of what is going on the ground and had to debunk videos from like 2009, 15, all the way back to 2011. And Robert is expert in this region. So enough soapbox time. Let's get into the basics. So just highlighting some BBC reporting, just for context, y'all. Don't even get me started on how Al Jazeera has covered this, but bearing in mind that the BBC was a news outlet, which was part of the rehabilitation of Abu al-Jolani into the interim president, Ahmed al-Shara. Let's just get some basic points. So here we go. Syria says operation against Assad loyalists after deadly violence. So they've announced an end to this operation, ostensibly. So their defense ministry of the new interim government says it has completed a military operation in the country's western coastal region after days of violence in which hundreds of people have been killed. Security forces had neutralized loyalists of former President Bashar al-Assad in several towns in Latakia and Tartus provinces, and were paving the way for life to return to normal. A monitoring group, the primary one here is going to be the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. That's based out of the UK. It's some of its affiliates or people affiliated with it have received U.S. State Department money. That's just something we have to bring up. But I was actually surprised that they did a good job with this because they have a history of problematic reporting. Gunmen loyal to the Sunni Islamist-led government, wow, I can't believe the BBC put that in there, have been accused of carrying out revenge killings against members of Assad's minority, Alawite sect, following a deadly ambush on a security patrol. So basically everything I've heard from the ground, even from Alawites themselves, basically in the town of Jable on the coast, they were government security forces were trying to execute a sort of warrant to arrest someone affiliated with the Assad government, the deposed government. The story's murky what happened, but it led into an ambush by pro-Assad elements, or at least they're called Assadists. I don't think they actually believe that they can reinstall Assad as a political figure in Syria ever again. And that sparked the mobilization of not just government forces, but also militias as well. And there's I've heard there's over like 40 different militias in Syria associated with the government. Some are more secular, some are more extremist. And they carried out a series of revenge killings on the Alawite minority. And I don't think they were going off of any intelligence on who these gunmen were. I think it just seems like a mass civilian punishment and kind of a rogue action. I'm not convinced that Jelani can actually control a lot of these people.
Yeah, well, the way that this started was, you could call it some sort of an insurgency or a rebellion, which was led by the Coastal Guard group. I'm not going to get into speculation on what I've heard on who funds it, because I can't verify that information yet. However, there does seem to be strong evidence to suggest that it was receiving some sort of logistical support from the SDF in northeast Syria. Again, that's not confirmed, but a lot of strong indications are of that. That group itself was formed of former Syrian Arab army officers and soldiers, some of whom, for instance, were given amnesty when the new government took over Damascus. In fact, the situation with the fall of Damascus and the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad was that many of the Syrian Arab army forces were the first ones to enter to Damascus before many of the HTS fighters ever came in order to stabilize the situation first. So a lot of these people were given amnesty, but what was also going on in the background were these field executions over the period of about 2 months. They weren't what a lot of people expected in terms of the scale of these field executions, but it was still quite horrific. The video evidence, the photographic evidence, the families produced the testimonies. So we know that these field executions were ongoing. Suddenly we had this day-long, basically, rebellion. There was a series of ambushes. You mentioned the one in Jabre that occurred. And suddenly what this became is, we're taking out the Assadists, the Assad loyalists, the remnants of the regime, completely pushing aside any of the grievances that the Alawi sect, which at one point at the end of that first day was calling for federalization. The Supreme Alawite Council, I believe, put out a statement which hinted at federalization being protected because of what ended up happening, the reaction that was coming in. And we saw that Jolani, or Ahmed al-Shara, sent his security forces in, along with paramilitary forces, Turkish-backed forces, and also then civilians in places like Idlib were handed weapons and were allowed to go into the countryside to basically carry out revenge killings, and they acted as sectarian death squads. And the total death toll, we're not too sure on right now. Some people are saying 5,000, 7,000. For sure, it's well in excess.
At least 1,000. Yeah.
It's really impossible for us to tell what the actual civilian death toll is at this point. Many areas still haven't been reached. Many of the bodies haven't been counted yet. But it's very clear that this was sectarian bloodshed. The majority against the Alawi sect, but also against Sunnis who were neighbors to Alawi families who stood up for them, for instance, were murdered. Them along with other family members, Sunni family members, and Christians as well. that were murdered. Other people were saying Druze and Kurds. I didn't see any evidence.
I haven't heard about that. No, I mean, there was an incident last week in the Druze community. There was security forces went in there. There seems to be a sort of a tick fight. And that seemed to have been resolved, or at least it didn't explode into a wider conflict between the Druze and the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was some fighting, but yeah, like you said, it was prior. It wasn't during this fighting on the coast. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't heard of any Druze being killed during this time. But what's interesting about this is that the reaction has been anyone talking about this essentially as being called an Assadist. They're being called somebody who supported the former regime. There's no nuance there. In fact, many of these people who were ecstatic when Jolani took over Damascus are pretending as if there were no massacres at all because of the stream of disinformation that came in. There were fake videos, for instance. There were videos, like you mentioned at the start, which were from years ago of ISIS execution. Some people pulled footage in from Gaza. Some people used photos of beheaded people from other countries. And so there was disinformation passed around on this topic. And it's very difficult to know and filter through what exactly is true when there's such a flood of information like this. But we do know a huge civilian massacre or series of civilian massacres were committed. Sources on the ground confirm this. There are a plethora of videos recorded by Jolani's men, essentially, in the security forces themselves, some of whom were bragging about what they were doing. Others were filming videos actually criticizing what had happened and what they had seen as well. So that's also something that was going on. But there were a lot of people who, were very loyal to the side of the Syrian, before what was the Syrian opposition, now what is the Syrian government in Damascus, and who are loyalists to this new government, who were trying to defend it. Essentially, either by providing justifications about remnants of the regime. Some people were openly talking about the Alawites had it coming, and others were just flatly denying it and saying, look, there's all of this disinformation, nothing happened, or trying to say that the security forces didn't carry out any of the killings. Those who have been documenting this know that the security forces were involved because there's video evidence of them, and because as well, all of the trustworthy reporting that's been done on this indicates that the security forces, the Syrian security forces, were involved in some of the atrocities. Whether they carried out the bulk of those atrocities or not, it's not clear. I would lean towards saying it was paramilitary forces, that it was these more radical tech theory groups that carried out these killings. But that's something that I suppose we will see the evidence compiled on.
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard from multiple people is like there was two specific militias that were bad, the Amshat and Hamzat militias, but of course we can't confirm any of this. The fog of war on this is really thick, so we're gonna have to wait. But it's not just, obviously I can't show any of the videos here because this is going up on YouTube, but they were doing, some security forces were doing some IDF-esque stuff, saying like, yes, we're going to kill all the Alawites, and the Ministry of Defense is going to bring the hammer down, essentially. And they're posting these to Facebook. Most of them. So like most of the videos I've been sent were taken from HTS affiliated Facebook accounts. So like, just an example.
الله أكبر. الآن انطلاق وزارة الدفاع مع إدارة أمن العام إلى جبال العلوية. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الآن جاء القتال يا أحفاد القردة والخنازير. الآن جاء القتال يا أحفاد القردة.
Yeah, just a lot of rants going on. from, I don't know, people associated with the government. So like that's one of the more tame things we can provide. But the big question is this like an institutional practice that we can trace like we can in the IDF and their Gaza policy, or if it was just these militia groups. But I guess moving on, do you have a sense that the violence is kind of coming to an end now?
This round of violence might be coming to an end. The one thing that we had to understand, obviously things change very rapidly in Syria. There's just been an agreement signed apparently between the SDF and the Syrian government that will, over the period of a year, apparently integrate the SDF into the Syrian army. So again, it's very hard to tell exactly what will happen and when it will happen. This is an interesting agreement because the SDF apparently were helping the uprising, which then triggered this sectarian bloodshed after it was essentially ordered and permitted. But the one thing I will say about this incident is that Ahmed al-Shara, essentially, he has around, with his Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group, had around 20,000 men. And then through allied militias, it's estimated around 15,000. So that's not actually that many. The Syrian army, it's tiny. Hamas has more fighters than that, for instance, or that's at least what they did have before, or the estimates that were provided, let's say. And so his forces, there's not that many of them. And as we discussed last time when we were talking about this topic, there are a plethora of different groups filled in their ranks with people who are some a bit more moderate, some who are secular leaning, and a lot of them who are these takfiri Salafist types. These people that are extremely radical and they have the ideology of Al-Qaeda. That's who they are. They are Al-Qaeda and Daesh. That's their ideology, and that's never changed. They're very, very extreme in the way they think. And if they're not of that ideology, many of them also adhere to what I would call this Sunni nationalism, this idea which I would say is equivalent to a Muslim's Zionism, where they give a theological backbone to a nationalist ideology specifically for one sect within Islam. This has nothing to do with Sunni Islam, in my opinion. The actual doctrine, I have nothing to do with this as a practicing Sunni Muslim. But this is something that you see with a lot of people who are very, very, very sectarian. And you get this from people who don't even necessarily have to be super religious to think this way. These people who are within the ranks of the different groups, which are now been merged into Jilani's security forces, are extremely radical, and they're not going to change. And if you unleash them on any area where there's a rebellion, this sort of stuff is going to happen again and again and again. And it seems like Jilani has allowed it to happen. It was obvious what was going to happen, in my opinion, when he was ordering this. I and others could see it from a mile away. As soon as this was called, I saw the speech go up. I feared the worst. And we already had these massacres that were happening at the time, but essentially he was giving the green light to the most radical elements within his ranks. And so because of the fact that we have a situation like this, and for instance, they drew the security forces from across the country. It took a lot of effort for them to come and try and quell this. I have a feeling that things like this could possibly happen again if there's not anything put in place to safeguard it from stopping. And it's not even clear that all of the killing has stopped yet.
No, not at all.
It looks like there's still, sectarian killing ongoing, even though apparently the security operation, as they call it, is done. And so I would say that it is likely that these sort of things are going to happen. And it robs Ahmed al-Shara of legitimacy in my eyes. He's going to struggle now to get legitimacy amongst the minorities. It's going to be very difficult for him because people are going to genuinely fear the men who are on his side. And not only that, we don't have confirmation of these videos, but it seems like helicopters were being used to bomb different sites in the countryside. And you had to ask yourself, who were flying those helicopters? Were they Jolani's men, who, when they first arrived in Halab or Aleppo, they had to go on YouTube to try and find out how to fly these things? Or were they former people who were with the Syrian Arab Army who were flying them previously, who were being accused by these same people who are now loyalists of this government of being the people dropping barrel bombs and indiscriminate munitions from helicopters on civilian areas? Obviously, it's going to be the people from the former government, or it's going to be foreigners that are brought in, people who are specialists who know how to do this. So you have to look at this. It's a very, very complex picture. But if I had to predict it, I would say there's a strong likelihood that there will be more sectarian violence. It might not be on the coast. It might be in the south. And it's not just that I think that this could happen again. It's two factors, primary factors. Number one is that there are a lot of foreign actors that are bidding on sectarian violence, that are trying to take advantage of this situation to essentially either cause permanent chaos or balkanize Syria. And then I have serious questions around Ahmed al-Shara and his ability to bring the country together at this point because of the way that this was handled. And then the propaganda that followed as well. And the fact that there has been very little mercy shown. It's not like they've taken this seriously. If this wasn't his security forces, and he believed that this is all lies against his government, then you should come out and you should oppose this very strongly. And oppose this kind of sectarian killing. But what we have from people who support this government is a lot of deflecting and a lot of denial as well, when clearly we do know that sectarian killing and bloodshed has occurred.
Yeah. Generally, what I hear when I bring up these points is, the main criticism is I am discrediting the revolution. So let's look at some of his own words here given yesterday about these killings. And apparently they're going to put together a 7-person commission to investigate these war crimes, the sectarian violence. But I would not expect anything to come out of that.
All right,
I'm going to transliterate for those of you who are only listening to the audio. Some of the remnants of the fallen regime sought to test new Syria that they did not know, and here they are today getting to know it anew, seeing it as one and unified from east to west, from north to south. If a province is touched by a thorn, all the provinces will rally to support it in honor. In Syria today, there is no difference between the authority and the people. Syria is concerned about everyone's mission to preserve and support it. This was embodied last night. There is no fear for a country with such a people and such a spirit. Remnants in the battle of liberation, we fought you as one who is keen on your lives. Okay. Anyways, yes, a lot of words along those lines. Basically not acknowledging that was happening at all. And one of the things that's interesting now, in terms of him trying to send a unifying message to the country, you pointed this out earlier, he didn't really address the concerns of minorities at all.
No, he'll use this language of we need to be unified, but then what are the concerns of these people? You've allowed for these thugs, essentially, for 2 months to just get away with what they're doing. Yes, there have been cases of people being held accountable, but it's still happening. And why is it still happening? And then you have to address their concerns. Eventually, after 2 months of ongoing field executions, and it's not just that, it's not just the field executions, because that affects some people, but a lot of those cases were actually against people who were former members of the Syrian Arab Army and security apparatus of Bashar.
There was supposed to be an amnesty agreement about that, though.
There was
come and
supposed
lay
to
down
be.
your arms. Yeah.
That's the exact problem as well, is there was supposed to be this amnesty agreement, but then these people are getting pulled out of their houses and shot in the street. And obviously people don't feel secure. But the big problem is the economy was tanking. The economy was getting worse under the new government than it was during the rule of Bashar. They were mass layoffs in government positions, mass layoffs at hospitals, factories are shutting down. And the country is not improving economically. And so all of the elements are there for these sort of rebellions to take place, and especially if you don't address their concerns. And then on top of it, if these sectarian nutjobs, who that's what they are allowed to still have weapons, and you allow them in your security forces, maybe because you're scared that if you don't, they might do something to you and they might try and overthrow the state. Because this is a thing, when they talk about the revolution winning and all of this, in reality, what happened is there was no war at the end. There was no battle. The Syrian Arab Army didn't fight. The original operation was planned just for Aleppo. That was supposed to be an 8-month affair. That's what they prepared for. And they were prepared for a big battle. But they weren't prepared to take the entire country, and they didn't know that the entire Syrian army was just going to collapse. It was going to fall, and it wasn't going to fight, and many of them would defect. They didn't know that that was going to happen. So there wasn't actually a war to take over in the end. In 2018, it turned into a sort of frozen conflict with occasional flare-ups, and then suddenly the Syrian army fell. Bashar al-Assad's regime fell, and now the opposition are in charge. But you have to be, for people that say, well, this is, you're undermining the revolution when you say this, exactly what element of it is being undermined to say that sectarian death squads should not be killing minorities? That's not undermining anything. That's a criticism, a normal criticism of any government, of any movement, whether it's a national liberation movement that's struggling to create a state, or it's an actual government that's formed. It doesn't matter. That's a normal conversation to have. It's a normal criticism to have. I think many people wanted there to be peace and stability. Unfortunately, there is an enormous amount of outside actors, chiefly amongst them Israel, which wants to divide the country into these essentially sectarian or
client states.
Client states that they would have some sort of relations with, and would essentially expand their power and then undermine the power of whatever regime would be run from Damascus. And that's their aims. So there are a lot of conspiracies against this government, but at the same time, this is civilian. These are civilian massacres, and they can't be undermined to say, yes, there's an Israeli conspiracy, or there is, there's an agreement struck here between this player, and these people who did this uprising and killed just over a dozen security forces on one day. They were people that used to be affiliated with the Syrian Arab Army, commanders, and even corrupt people before. Because they killed just over a dozen security forces, there's this massive plot, and therefore let's just ignore more than 1,000. This is what seems to be the accepted figure at this point. It could possibly be more than 1,000 civilians being killed. Confirmed cases of entire families being gunned down in their homes for their sect. These are the sort of things that people were arguing that they wanted the revolution to stop. That's what the original arguments that a lot of these people were providing. We don't want this sort of bloodshed to happen where people can just be killed in their homes for criticizing the government or whatever, and being taken and tortured for criticizing the government. Well, what just happened here? What happened here was specifically in this case, and this is something that has to be pointed out. This was the specific targeting of Alawi, the Alawi sect, and it also others who criticized. They killed Sunnis who criticized. And
yeah,
those
wasn't a Sunni sheikh killed in Damascus, executed in Damascus for condemning these killings?
Yeah, and I believe that that wasn't, according to the information that at least was passed on to me, that was not ordered by the security forces. I may be wrong again on that. I may have the incorrect information. That was carried out by independent elements. But still, this is the thing. They operate in an environment where that sort of those sort of actions can take place. That these sort of revenge killings or killings for the sake and torture, because he was tortured first, that's at least what the evidence suggests, that this sort of thing can go on, and that people feel emboldened enough and that they live in an environment where they can get away with this. And that's something that needs to be addressed. That cannot exist in a normal functional state. And in fact, you look at the way that the European Union started addressing this and talking about the attack on the security forces, while hundreds of people at that time were being mass murdered. And this really speaks to what the European Union and Western countries' roles in Syria have always been. Not to safeguard the civilian population. At the end of the day, there were a lot of people that were advocating for the sanctions on the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who were saying, no, it's just hitting Bashar, who were on the opposition side. They had a strategy that they wanted to remove him. That's their strategic side of this. But let's look at what was actually happening. The people were poor. Bashar al-Assad, he had a massive car collection and lived in a rather luxurious lifestyle. It didn't affect him, just like the sanctions did not affect Saddam Hussein. The issue here that we have is that people have a very, very short memory, and they're not able to critically analyze what's happening in terms of, yes, there's foreign actors that are behaving, but you have to be able to criticize what is going on when this sort of killing happens. You have to look at what connections are actually being made here. It is a very complicated picture. Either of us can get it wrong and right on one day or the other. So anyone can be wrong or right about what's going on in Syria at different points. It's very hard to say, I know conclusively what is going on, and I can tell you the objective truth of Syria. No one can really do that. But what we have to do is avoid getting into these trade-offs, yelling names at each other, and sectarian incitement, essentially, fitna. We don't want to get into this battle now. There's a new Syrian government that has to be accepted, but it cannot get away with this sort of behavior. How are the minorities ever going to accept an administration that does this? I don't know whether they can. Because all of us who have been watching this have been shocked. But I know many friends in Syria who are Sunni, by the way, who are appalled by this, but they're scared to talk about it. And what does that tell you about this government? It's not a good sign.
Yeah, it's really not. And there's a number of other signs that aren't exactly great now. First of all, he's calling al-Shara, the interim president, is calling for unity from east to west, north to south, and they have a massive sovereignty problem on their southern border. Bringing this up right now. Times of Israel from yesterday. IDF says it seized, destroyed weapons and targeted raid in southern Syria. Army confirms reports of action beyond the buffer zone. Issues footage from operations. So we have some pictures here. These guys look like special operations forces. The Israeli military said Saturday carried out several targeted raids in southern Syria over the past week while issuing footage from its operations. The IDF, the weapons included rifles, ammunitions, rockets, and other military gear. And, earlier this week, Syrian media reported that Israeli forces were operating near Tel Al-Mal Peak in the Dara governorate, where a military post belonging to former Syrian regime once stood. The hill is located some 13 kilometers from Israel's border, well outside a buffer zone between the countries that Israel captured following the fall of Bashar al-Assad. So basically, the IDF has described its presence in southern Syria's buffer zone as a temporary and defensive measure, though Defense Minister Israel Katz has said the troops will remain deployed to 9 army posts in the area indefinitely. So there's something interesting in terms of the information landscape going on. First of all, Israel at first, let's just generalize Israel as their media apparatus. So at first they celebrated the fall of Bashar al-Assad. He was he was the big axis of resistance guy. He wasn't, but he allowed arms and intelligence to flow through Syria in exchange for certain perks. But now, because I monitor their Hezbollah accounts, now what they're saying is they're doing this campaign to basically highlight the fact that Giuliani was former Al-Qaeda and all of his HTS guys are extremists. So it's an interesting dynamic where the Western media tried so hard to completely rehabilitate him to Western audiences. And now Israel's, their apparatus is basically, no, he's a terrorist. We're not safe. We need to invade more, and we can't leave Syria in order to protect our own borders. So I was wondering if you could comment on those dynamics.
Well, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which HTS, was formerly al-Nusra, which was al-Qaeda in Syria. That's a fact. Ahmed al-Shara was formerly a commander in Daesh. These are facts. These were also facts when Israel was providing military support. It was providing financial support, and it was treating the fighters of al-Nusra in field hospitals, because that's what they were doing. And this was at the time when Nusra was at a very radical point and was carrying out massacres of the likes of Druze. It was carrying out massacres of the Druze. It was carrying out massacres of Christians and of Adawi at those times. So Israel now turns around and goes, oh, look how horrible this group is. And look, these are Islamists and terrorists, and we can't allow these people on our border. Israel was backing around a dozen groups, opposition groups, many of them with ideologies very similar to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Yes, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham did somewhat change in its orientation over the years in Idlib, especially after sort of 2017, 2018. It developed into something a little bit different. It still had many of these fighters in its ranks, these radical fighters in its ranks during this time, and still does today. But Israel backed it. Israel provided funding for it. They didn't care so much when they were quite literally on the border of the Golan Heights, of the occupied portion of the Golan Heights that they remained in. They didn't care. In fact, they were going back and forth across the border, and they weren't threatened by the Islamist extremists. This is just an excuse. It's just an excuse to attack Syria, to seize more territory, and to help as well, because now they have the argument. And again, this is why it's so frustrating watching some people try and defend what has happened in the countryside, because that is playing into Israel's hands. These targeting the sectarian killings are playing into Israel's hands. As soon as those security forces start carrying out those killings, now there's a justification for Israel to come in and work with another foreign power in order to make a separate state for any group, whether they be Druze. Obviously, they've been working. The Kurdish issue is a little bit different, but Israel's still been working with them to pursue their own goals. And then on the coast with the Alawi to be some sort of protectorate. And so it plays into their hands. And then that's what we've seen now, is that they're saying, oh, look, these Islamists are killing the minorities, and Israel stands with the minorities. When we stand with the groups that were killing these minorities the entire time. So they propped them up and they worked with other Western regimes and intelligence agencies to prop them up. And then they go, oh, look how horrible they are. Let's bomb the entire country, invade these places and steal the land. And then, back the minority groups. So it's just hypocritical.
Right. And so what is your take on the bulk? We talk a lot about the interests, certain foreign interests wanting to balkanize Syria. I think we should talk about that and kind of like break it down, the different interests and why they want balkanization and not a strong central government in Syria. And of course, it's hard to speculate how all this is going to turn out because, as you brought up, breaking now, SDF is now going to apparently, and this could fall apart at any time, integrate with the HTS interim government, a military vertical integration. So I don't know how that's going to work out because they don't even have a strong central military authority, which is why they have 40 different like militias running around doing whatever the hell they want. So it looks like it's going to be a huge mess, and it's not going to get resolved in any sort of clean way. And I do think there's going to be more internecine violence, but balkanization, why?
Well, this could serve a variety of interests, of different interests, and we have to look at it in terms of what different powers might want now, and then what they may have wanted in the past. For instance, there's been a lot of documents shared around from the US government, the Hillary Clinton leaked emails about wanting to prolong the conflict in Syria and just have ongoing chaos and make sure that the situation never is resolved. And that's because they don't want a strong central government in Syria that will be armed, that would have weapons. The Israelis are very clear about that. They will not allow a strong Syrian army to ever emerge again. They've explicitly stated this. The United States are the same way.
They've made sure the second Assad fled, they instituted a massive bombing campaign of the Syrian army's military and materiel infrastructure.
Absolutely, straight away they went to it, and it was pre-prepared. And at that point, I don't think anyone exactly knew when the offensive against Aleppo was launched that the government was going to fall so rapidly. I don't think anyone could have predicted that really. But certainly, the Israelis wanted to see balkanization from the very beginning. That was their plan for a very long time. They've wanted to extend this buffer zone. They've been talking about a Druze state, which they put under their protection since essentially more than a decade now. They've been talking about this and putting out different plans and proposals specifically for this buffer zone and what it will look like. And now they're doing basically exactly that. And they need the Druze there to help them do that if it's going to work.
Absolutely. And, I just wanted to bring up, Israelis have a lot of different doctrines, right? You've got the Da'iyah doctrine, the mass collective punishment of civilians in order to put political pressure on the associated military to that population. You got the Hannibal Directive. You have all these different doctrines. And what we're and they've been instituted for a long time. And it's kind of interesting or fascinating that the Israeli apparatus doesn't really change their tactics that much. So and I've been bringing this up for the past 3 days. I'm just trying to get it into the public discourse so you guys can recognize these certain like multi-generational aspects of Israeli foreign policy. And so with the Druze client state that they're talking about specifically, we're going to just bring up the most basic definition of their alliance of the periphery or doctrine of the periphery, which refers to a foreign policy strategy developed by Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in 1999. Mayor Amit, the head of the Mossad, described it, quote, as an alliance with all the actors in the Middle East who are not Muslim Arabs. And so the alliance, how it was originally conceived, would include Turkey, be at the time the imperial state of Iran pre-revolution, Ethiopia, but also Druze, Copts, Kurds, Berbers, Middle Eastern Christians, South Sudanese, and it was thought to insulate them, buffer zone, and they use the term periphery because they see themselves as the core, and all of these little groups and other actors in the periphery, which would act as buffers. If they couldn't actually hold ground or take the territory themselves, they want client states and client actors that will further their goals in the region and give them political cover for like the dirty work that far-right Maronite Christians did during their occupation of Lebanon in the 80s. So that's just one example.
And they do need these minority groups in said country in order to occupy the territory, or else they're going to stretch their army. I mean, their army's already way overstretched at this point. And if it needs to be called into the West Bank, for instance, to quell an uprising, it's going to be in a lot of trouble if it also wants to occupy territory in Syria or in territory in southern Lebanon. Obviously, it's not wanting to operate the same sort of occupation that it once had in southern Lebanon, but it's still around a kilometer deep into their territory in some areas. And in Lebanon, they used the South Lebanon Army. So they used these hardline fascist militia forces and essentially formed their proxy to rule over South Lebanon and do their dirty work. And similarly here, it looks like the very same doctrine that's coming into play. And again, they've worked at this specific buffer zone plan for more than a decade, this specific one that we're seeing here with the two, phased approach of where they want to occupy. They've known for a long time where they wanted to be inside the country, but how exactly that was going to look, they started developing it around 2013. They really took it very seriously. And so the Israelis, they clearly want to expand their territory, expand their borders, depending upon which Israeli politician or political party you speak to, they will give a different answer as to how far those borders are supposed to extend. But it's very, very clear that they want their influence to be absolute. They want to be the rulers of West Asia. They do not want an opposition of any kind that can rise against them that is notable in any way. They want total victory. That is the message of Benjamin Netanyahu, total victory, which means crushing completely the enemies throughout the region. And that extends to Iran as well, because the biggest enemies in the region are Iran and its allied actors. And so they're not going to allow a threat to develop in Syria, especially one that could be independent, which would eventually have to ally itself with Iran in some way. And this is something of a discussion that's been coming up, because how does this new Syrian government resist the Israelis when the Israelis are talking about now coming to Damascus and occupying Damascus, perhaps, and they're very, very close to Damascus. They're not far away now. And, the answer to that question is obviously the one actor that's going to back you is Iran. But, this new government has taken a position against Iran. So what do you do now? And Ahmed al-Shara, he's in sort of an impossible position. But again, now, after what we saw in the coast, what excuse is there for not mobilizing your men against the Israelis when they were mobilized in such a way in the coast? So the Israelis now are committing these violations. There's calls for jihad in the mosques near Dara and in the south of the country. The people are being forced from their homes, and the situation is quite dire there. And it's very obvious what Israel's intentions are, yet not a single bullet has been fired towards the Israeli forces in over 2 months. Nothing has really materialized. The only thing we've heard is a statement that came at the Arab League meeting, which seemed to have changed. It's done a 180 on the Syrian leadership's position. But previously, before that, it was basically putting out feelers for normalization with Israel while it was still occupying the country. It's an incredibly complex picture to try and predict where this will go, what will happen. if a organic resistance forms in the south of the country, will the government forces back it? If the Israelis choose to go into Damascus, what will happen in that case? Will the leadership run? Will they stand firm and perhaps be assassinated by Israeli airstrikes? It's so difficult to understand what like the thinking of this new administration is.
I do have a prediction, and hopefully we'll never have to find out. But if there is an armed uprising in the South against Israeli occupation, I could totally see, after what just happened, I could totally see HTS rolling in there to put down violently the uprising against Israeli forces.
I think it would be slightly more difficult to do that. You may be completely correct, especially if it comes that resistance comes from minorities. But it may be very, very difficult to justify doing something like that. And it's not even promised that the Israelis will discriminate between who they're bombing in that case. They might just bomb.
I wouldn't bank on that.
I would say for them to do that, when it comes to the Palestinian issue and when it comes to the Israelis, to put down a group directly that is of Syrians in the south that is opposing Israeli occupation might be very difficult, unless perhaps we see that that group wants to separate from the Syrian government. Then maybe through whipping up this sectarian hatred, then you might have a justification for assaults on those forces. Again, it's so difficult to predict where this will go that it's hard to call it. Honestly, I don't know whether to comment on one way or another on this. A lot of people have fixed views. I don't.
No, I did not see the SDF signing any sort of agreement with the government, but hey, it happened. And they may have experienced, who knows, some political pressure from the United States to do so. As you know, we back the SDF publicly. They're the one group in Syria that we've publicly backed. We've also done a lot of clandestine backing of more problematic people, because it was a good propaganda point for us when we were trying to discredit the Assad regime and overthrow him. It's like, these Kurds are oppressed. They're not Muslim extremists. They're safe. They want to be free and do a democracy thing in the AANES. So they were, we've always had an intelligence and military relationship with them. And of course, the United States has betrayed the Kurds multiple times. But yes, that was surprising. I could see some political pressure. I do think the United States is pleased with the Syrian government and the chaos that's surrounding it. I was talking to some people in Damascus, and they had the sense that when it came to why the Syrian army didn't fight, and this is conspiracy theory, but it's what I've been hearing from people, they think like some backroom deal was struck between Israel, the United States, Turkey, Russia, to kind of balkanize the country. I'm not saying I completely agree with that assessment, but that's a general sense I'm getting from people I've talked to on the ground. But there always has been a very strong intelligence relationship between Israel and Turkey, which is why, you'll see Erdogan publicly condemn Gaza being leveled while not actually doing anything to stop it, because they're politically aligned in some ways. So that brings us to what Turkey's doing in the north and what their aspirations are for the future of Syria.
That's, again, a difficult thing to predict entirely. One thing I'll note is that Turkey has not been placing investments in Damascus. It's been placing its investments. It's been telling its investors, invest in Aleppo, but don't invest in Damascus, which is interesting to me. And it's very telling as to what perhaps they're forecasting for the region, and that they would rather have their influence there. And we know that there is this sort of, we can call it a neo-Ottoman vision, which would have them, people believe that Aleppo is actually Turkish, right?
Yeah, don't some people in the neo-Ottoman vision call it like their 85th covenant or something along those lines?
And you have these people that exist on the Turkish side. Whether they actually want to go and take Aleppo and annex it, that remains to be seen. But they were controlling de facto a portion of northern Syria, where there were people who were ethnically Turkish, their background, who were living there. Some of them, not all of them. Beforehand. So they were involved in the country for a very long time, and they sort of occupied two different strips of the country during the war before the fall of Bashar. And they still have a heavy influence now, and they have different militia forces, like the Syrian National Army is one of them, and then different militias that they back that are operating inside the country. And they've been using these groups to fight the SDF over the past few months. And for them now, they're backing this new Syrian government, and they have influence over this new Syrian government. And they have to sort of negotiate between this new Syrian government and other actors who are also trying to carve off their piece of the pie. And I think they have the strongest connection to this new Syrian government for sure. They have the most influence over it, but not total influence over it. And there's many ways that the new Syrian government in Damascus can aggravate Turkey. Also, Turkey has a problem, because if Turkey and the new Syrian government don't see eye to eye, and are at odds, and things start to get heated, we can see a situation where the two could be at some sort of state of war. That's very, very realistic that could end up happening, that there could be warfare between the two sides, or at least Turkish proxy groups. We saw that, for instance, last year when Bashar al-Assad was about to sign an agreement with Turkey, and it looked like there was going to be normalization between Syria and the Turkish government, suddenly these fighters from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham were opening fire at Turkish forces at the border, and were killing Turkish army soldiers. And that violence broke out very quickly, because I think Jolani saw the writing on the wall, and he did not want this to happen. That would essentially be a death sentence to the opposition. And so his forces, whether they were directly ordered or they were just given the green light and told you can go in and attack the Turkish forces, that happened. We're looking at the actors that are involved in this new Syrian government. It will take a long time to properly integrate all these forces. And some of them, for instance, you might have Chechens and Uyghurs and a German Salafist who wants to kill every single Shia in the Middle East, all in this administration with, Syrian nationalists who want to see a pluralistic Syria and a free Syria. So in order to integrate these forces, in order to purge the hardline elements, this would take an enormous amount of time. And also it takes the will. It takes the will to do it. And right now, we're not seeing the signs that anything serious has been done. The rhetoric is there. They're talking about the orders to crack down. But who are you cracking down on? Because the majority of your forces are behaving like this, or at least they're allowing sectarian bloodshed. And when Turkey looks at this, they've got to be quite scared about the potential repercussions that this has on them. They want more than anyone else to find some sort of solution to what's going on. And they've got this power dynamic, especially with the Israelis, where, okay, we manage the north, you manage the south, and let's stay out of each other's business. Because the Israelis, the last thing they want is to get into a conflict with Turkey. And Turkey absolutely does not want a conflict with the Israelis. That much is extremely clear at this point, that it does not want a conflict with the Israelis. It could have picked a fight with the Israelis at any point, and it hasn't done so. I'm not saying that there aren't people in the Turkish government that don't oppose Israel and they're pro-Palestinian and they want to fight for the Palestinians. There are a lot of people in Turkey that are staunchly pro-Palestinian and care about the Palestinian cause. But in terms of what the administration is doing, there's no signs that it wants to fight Israel. So it wants to try and find a solution. What that solution is going to be, they don't know. The Israelis don't yet know, and nobody else knows.
Yeah, and in the meantime, again, the situation serves the U.S. interests of isolating Iran and alienating Iran in the region as well. And of course, there's a lot of problems. A lot of Syrians have a good reasons for not liking Iranian interference. Many Syrians have good reasons for hating their affiliated organizations like Hezbollah, because Hezbollah went in during the Civil War and they were very violent and did some stuff, and it's a controversial topic. But if we're just looking at this from the perspective of American imperialism in the region, all of this is a win. And I'm not trying to knock on the revolution or the new government. That's just a fact that we have to come to terms with.
Yeah, I would jump on the point about Hezbollah because a lot of accusations are made about Hezbollah as somebody that covered the Syrian conflict and have contacts on both sides. I never saw evidence of Hezbollah killing women and children and killing civilians. I'm not saying it didn't happen and that those circumstances didn't come about, but I have not seen any evidence of Hezbollah killing civilians. In Syria, I just haven't seen the evidence of it. I know that Hezbollah were used and they fought on the side of the Syrian government. There were massacres committed by people in the Syrian Arab Army and the National Defense Forces. There were people killed by all different militias, but specifically Hezbollah. I've never seen any evidence that Hezbollah has gone on a rampage and killed civilians. I've just not seen it. I put the challenge out there for somebody to produce any evidence that Hezbollah has gone in and done civilian massacres, because I just have never seen any evidence of that. I understand people are angry, and I understand that people don't like Hezbollah because they backed the Syrian government, and many of those militias were very, very violent. I'm not going to deny that war crimes were committed, that civilians were massacred, and all of those things happened. They absolutely did. My question is, when it comes to this hatred which is put on Hezbollah, I haven't seen any evidence for what they're saying about Hezbollah. I've seen accusations. I've never seen evidence for it. Specifically when it comes to Hezbollah. Not Kataib Hezbollah from Iraq, Hezbollah as in Lebanese Hezbollah.
Right.
I just haven't seen it personally. And that's a point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. Also, looking at footage from the early days of the Syrian war, it's almost impossible to tell what's unless you see a Daesh flag, or actual iconography. It's kind of difficult to determine, or actual Syrian Arab army camouflage fatigue patterns. There's just so many foreign fighters and so many different uniforms and iconography going on in the conflict. It was kind of hard to determine who was doing what. But no, I'm not saying that I've seen evidence. I'm just saying that a lot of Syrians who I've talked to, that's what some of their assertions. Some Syrians love Hezbollah. But,
I think people believe that. But even when it comes to the Daesh patches, for instance, that's an age-old Islamic flag. And some people will put that up. And I think it's rather silly to do it because of what it's affiliated with now. But there are people who actually will wear that patch and people who will have that flag up, and they're not Daesh. So even that is hard to call. Some people, they go, oh, well, we see the patch, and then that must mean that they're Daesh. But that's not actually the case because it is an Islamic flag. And sometimes it's not used to represent Daesh. And where it is used to do that and where it's not is very difficult to tell. So it's even that is difficult to tell. But these people that are saying that Hezbollah has carried out these civilian massacres, again, specifically Hezbollah, I haven't seen the evidence of it. I'd be open to taking the evidence, to being passed on the evidence if someone can show it to me. But I've not seen evidence that Hezbollah has committed civilian massacres, that it's come in and purposefully went door to door and shot civilians in their homes and committed these sort of actions. I've just not seen the evidence to prove it.
Right. No, and I don't want to belabor this point too much, because we've talked about it for a minute now. The assertions I've heard was that they weren't going door to door. They're just like rounding up men who they may have suspected of being affiliated with the Islamic State and doing that. But that's, again, video evidence. No, not like we have for what happened these past few days in Syria. Especially not. And so I thought it was a great point. Like, in closing, when there's a lot of people who want to support this new government and they want a liberated sovereign Syria through this HTS interim government as a vehicle to attain that change. But the fact that you can't even criticize what their militias are doing and Jelani's response to it is a little unreasonable, I think.
It's wholly unreasonable. And I'm one of those people that wanted to see the best for Syria. I'm not attached to any Syrian government or any authority inside of Syria. Personally, as somebody that's analyzing it, I'm trying to make sense of it. But on a human level, I want Syrians to be secure. And I don't necessarily care what's their government, who it's run by, as long as it provides security for them and that the country can be secure and it can be a real independent country. I think everyone deserves the right to sovereignty. Of course, there's other issues as to how this government aligns. If it's going to be aligned with the corrupt Arab regimes, which are pro-United States and pro-European Union, then there presents a problem. Because what will this regime, even if it provides better lives for its people, what will it then do regionally? What will its role be? And then what horrors will come out of such an administration that goes along with US and European Union foreign policy and goes along with Israeli ambitions for the region? I believe that a regime that is going to work with the West and be subservient to the West is going to be a regime that can't, by definition, have proper independence. They won't allow it. The Lebanese army is a great example of this. The United States backs the Lebanese army. They provide material support. They provide funding. But is the Lebanese army really an army? No, it's a glorified security force, the glorified police force. It's not a real army because it's not allowed to be a real army. It can't protect its country. There might be a few security operations that it can do, but it's not allowed to protect its country. They won't fire a single bullet towards Israeli occupiers, not because necessarily the rank and file don't want to. Of course, they want to protect their country, but the United States will not allow that to happen. And the Europeans won't allow that to happen. The Saudis, they can't possibly do anything against the Israelis. The same with the United Arab Emirates. Now, these are, they collaborate with Western interests. They have their own interests and they're different countries. But if they're in that camp, then they serve the interests of the Israelis and the Americans and the Europeans. And if they serve those interests, then by definition, they are opposed to the Palestinian liberation cause and they are opposed to sovereignty of the countries of the region. They're opposed to freedom for those countries. You can't be free if you're under the thumb of the US empire. It's not possible. So
Yeah, and
that's something that has to be, like you said, that has to be criticized. And there has to be open discourse about this. There are some people, they want to come in and they want to dictate to Syrians this and that and the other and tell them how to behave and all of the rest. And there's a lot of unfair people out there as well, who, for instance, still are, they think that they want Bashar al-Assad to come back. There are people like that.
Yeah, well, that's never going to happen, but yeah, that's true.
Those people exist, right? And so there are those people. But now we're in a different environment. There's a new government there. And there shouldn't be these sort of fights and this protective sort of way of dealing with this issue when we're talking about criticizing sectarian massacres. We're talking about criticizing policy of the current government, not to hate on it just for the sake of hating on it, but to criticize it because people who are criticizing are normally wanting the country to get better. Some they don't. Some they have their own goals, of course. But a lot of people who are criticizing now genuinely want their country to get better. They're Syrians inside of Syria. They're people on the outside, and they want their country to run normally. They want a pluralistic Syria. They want a free Syria for all of its people. And there needs to be open discourse about these things. There cannot be this closed-minded hatred of anything that comes out criticizing the current administration. Because if it's going to be that way, it's going to result in more fighting. It's going to result in more conflict. And I'll just put the point out there that if your force propping up your armed forces, like if the size of your armed forces is in total 35,000 men, it can be overthrown very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and especially if you pit yourself against every minority community in Syria, it's a large percentage of the population. It's not hard to then bring over a chunk of the Sunni population who are already living in dire economic situation, not seeing it get any better, and are also angry at what they're seeing happening to their brothers and sisters, their neighbors who are of different minority communities. And if that happens, then we're in a very, very bloody situation. If a full-scale civil war breaks out, it's going to be very, very bloody. It's going to be very bad. So the criticism needs to come now. The debates need to be had now, and not shutting them down by screaming Assadist and how dare you criticize Jolani as if Jolani is somehow a prophet.
Actually, you can't. If you call Jolani, you're an Assadist. You have to call him Al-Shara now.
Al-Shara. He called himself Jolani for all these years. That's why it stuck in my head. But yeah, like you want to call him whatever you want to call him. He calls himself Ahmed Al-Shara. No, okay, we can call him that. We can call him whatever you want. But this is exactly the problem. He called himself Abu Muhammad al-Jolani for the longest time. So people like myself who've been following the conflict for a very long time, that's his name. That's when I see his photo, I see videos of him. That's who I associate. That's the name in my head I associate with it. That's not because I'm exhibiting some sort of a bias and I'm trying to pick a side. But again, all the language here, whether you use government or regime, these words, for instance, and this is why I try to say government all the time and not regime, because when it comes to Syria specifically, because if you say these words, then you're on one side. You're saying the regime for this and government for this. I say government for all, because again, I'm not trying to pick a side here. I'm trying to objectively analyze what's happening. And I think now is a fair time to do that. At the beginning, I tried to stay as silent as possible on trying to provide predictions, and I was just watching it unfold. I'm still watching it unfold. But when it comes to civilian massacres, you have to address this with condemnation. It's just human. I'm not going to sit here and defend for political purposes mass killings of ethnic minorities in any country. I don't care what the cause is. It doesn't matter. It could be Palestinian liberation fighters. If they're mass killing an ethnic minority, if they went in the West Bank and started killing the Christians, some group that's fighting on behalf of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, they would be condemned immediately. Mm-hmm. And they would be criticized. And inside Palestine, they would be massively criticized. Inside Palestinian society would not accept that. So we should not accept that for Syria either. It should be the same rule across the board. Sectarian bloodshed is condemned. And this weak excuse that is provided by some people go, oh yeah, but Assad did this. Yeah, he did. Okay, Assad did all these horrible things. We're not talking about Assad now. We're talking about the new government. And we're also at a stage, well, oh, he said he's going to investigate. He needs to address the concerns of these minority groups. That needs to happen in this country. And it's
I
very
think,
obvious that that needs to take place.
and I think now we're kind of at the end of our time, but I do think that, don't like to make predictions, obviously, especially with a battle space like Syria, but now that the violence is ramping down, that's what it looks like. At least this cycle of violence is ramping down. If he doesn't address the concerns of the minorities within like a week, 2 weeks after this, I think that'll be really telling.
Yeah, this is the problem is the legitimacy. I don't know if he's going to have legitimacy, especially in the coast now. And for the people, again, trying to justify this is what you're doing is, the more that this can just be brushed off, the worse it's going to be in terms of the way that it's received. There were thousands of Alawi civilians who took shelter in a Russian military base and slept in tents.
I'm glad we brought that up.
Yeah, there was thousands that fled across the border as well into Lebanon. Like, these people fled their homes in fear, not because, oh, they heard on social media that somebody shared a video. Yeah, that might have factored into it, but they knew what was happening to their people. They saw it. They heard from their contacts. They heard from family members what was going on. That's how I've been informed of a lot of what went on from people on the ground inside of Syria, not from the videos that we've seen, which are horrific. And many of them, it's very obvious what they are. They're calling for the deaths of Alawi, and they're calling the Alawi pigs and burning down their homes. We've seen a lot of that. But this is the thing, like, with these people being forced out of their homes and forced to live in tents and being forced across the border and have these mass killings and these scares and not properly be consoled by a government who says, no, this is not what we're going to do. We're going to hunt down all these people. Like, your concerns are valid. We're going to come in. We're going to form a commission. We're going to talk to you properly. No, none of that. Like, it's these very, very surface level attempts to address this issue, which is extremely serious. These people were killed with what can be said as genocidal intent by a lot of these people who were making videos and who were chanting genocidal chants against the Alawi. This has to be addressed. And if it's not, then what is going to be the future of Syria? And can you even blame, at that point, the minorities for wanting federalization? Could you even blame them? Because at that point, it's a self-defense thing. It's about self-preservation. And this is something that actually, which I feel has to be addressed before we end. I know we've taken up quite a bit of time. At the start of the Syrian civil war, a lot of the minority communities actually sided, including Christians, Druze, Alawi, and this is true, even the Alawi, were siding with the opposition. Mm-hmm. What happened is that the opposition was overrun by militant groups associated with Al-Qaeda and that were committing their own sectarian massacres. And because this sort of sectarian bloodshed occurred, and because they were taking people's cousins, ransoming them, and then sending their severed heads to them, and they were committing these horrible atrocities, many of the Christians, the Druze, the Alawi, who either were neutral or were supporting the overthrow of the government, they were supporting revolution, then changed, and they supported and they threw their weight behind the government. And the reason they did that, again, self-preservation and fear. They saw, okay, if these guys run the country, then we're all dead. And then again, this is what you're reinforcing with many of these minority communities who fought for so long. That's why the Syrian Arab army fought for so long, is because of all these atrocities. That's why it kept together. The reason why it fell apart at the end and it wouldn't fight, a large component of it, is that they felt like there was nothing to fight for anymore. And the opposition was way more reasonable than it was before. It was a lot more hardline. And it provided them with amnesty and all these agreements, and it was a lot better than it was in the past, objectively. But now what you're doing is you're throwing these people into fear again, and they're going, okay, we can never trust you. So we either have to leave the country, or we have to have, we have to have a separate state, or at least we're going to have our own sort of protectorate. We're going to have our own borders. We're going to police our own areas. You're not going to have anything to do with this. And we need a strong military presence and force to protect us, to make sure that you can't kill us again. Because if you're just going to send these nut jobs with rifles to come in door to door and kill people, this can't be a state, and they can't exist in such a state. And the Christians will follow. Some Christians were killed in these massacres as well. The Christians will think the exact same thing, the different denominations of Christians that exist throughout Syria. Many Sunnis will think the exact same thing as well. There's an enormous amount of secular people, especially in the cities in Syria, who will think the exact same thing. So you're losing credibility by allowing this to pass and just, oh, no, it's nothing. No, it's not nothing. When over 1,000 civilians are killed, that is not nothing. That is a huge massacre, and it's something that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that he will. I don't know how you handle that, because from his perspective, because what are you going to do? Condemn it and then alienate all these dangerous militias that could just go completely rogue in the countryside? So
exactly. So he's in an impossible position, and he's put himself in that position. And this is why it's suspicious why he gave the green light to do this, because he had to have known what was going to happen. And I've heard the speculation is he wanted to allow these forces to do something like this because the situation in the country was not going well. So allow the bloodletting to sort of stave off some of these internal
just like a morale booster for a little bit.
Yeah. I think that could be it. From who I've spoken to, who have the ability to judge Jelani's character sort of from the inside, who I've spoken to in the past, who give some sort of representation of his character, it doesn't seem like he himself is hardline in the Al-Qaeda mentality, although he was, very much in these organizations and leading, Al-Qaeda in Syria. I think he's very flexible with his ideology, and that's very clear. I think if you follow the trajectory of his career, he's not very fixed. He's more of he's looking to be a leader, right? And he'll be flexible. That's what I'm getting as well from what we're seeing of him, not just what I've heard about him as well. And so the question here is, was it just like a little, let them, do bloodletting, make these more radical elements happy for a little bit?
Buy myself some time while we try to entrench this government. So, yeah. Well, that's a horrifying thought. But I guess time will tell. We'll see if he can keep these militias in line, or if they'll need to do repeated bloodlettings every 3 or 4 months in order to, maintain their integrity with regards to their integration into the state military apparatus. So without any condemnations and allaying the fears of minorities, they're going to continue to have civil unrest, and the unwillingness to criticize a government is always a political problem. So thanks, Robert Inlakesh, so much for coming on and doing this, breaking down the Syria situation from a very reasonable and balanced point. I was going to contribute a little bit more, but I was like, you know what? This is great. So really appreciate it. And you can basically find Robert here in his work and his writings and his investigations here on MintPress News. So thank you very much. All right, y'all. And that is a wrap. We will see you next week to break down whatever happens next weekend. So good luck out there, and we'll be back shortly.